Hello, I'm Stephen Coates. This is the Bureau of Lost Culture. And this is the story of a man who drilled a hole in his own head in order that he get and stay high forever. But before we hear that story, I would like to invite you to come join us at the Bureau of Lost Culture. Go to bureauoflostculture.com. You can find all our previous work there, and you can sign up to join us for special Bureau treats. You can also support us in our wild endeavours if you choose to do so. Joey Mellen was born in 1939 to an upper middle class English family. Like many of those born to such a family, he attended a private school, Eton, and then he attended Oxford University. And then he went to work in his father's stockbroking firm. But then everything changed. He tuned in, turned on, dropped out. And like many other young people in the 60s, started to live the life of a beatnik, of a hippie. But unlike many of the other young people, he did something in 1968 which was to change him and, in some ways, make him famous or infamous. He carried out an act of self-trepanation. Trepanation comes from the Greek word trepanon, meaning to bore, not as in to talk endlessly about oneself, but as in the creation of a hole, in this case, a hole in the skull. Perforated skulls with holes in them have been found all over the world in prehistoric sites, up to 8,000 years old. Sometimes the holes were made by scraping away the bone within a flint knife until a piece could be prized out. That sounds painful. Holes might be drilled into a person's skull if they were behaving in what was considered to be an abnormal way to let out what were thought to be evil spirits. The bone that was cut out was sometimes kept by prehistoric people to be worn as a charm to keep such evil spirits away. It's also been speculated that it was performed as some kind of religious symbolic act, an initiation into a priestly or shamanic caste. It was used through the 18th, 19th and even 20th centuries when doctors employed it as a means to treat the insane or the melancholic, or even those with just headaches. It was replaced in the 1930s by the procedure known as lobotomy, by which a deeper hole was cut in the skull and parts of the brain removed or destroyed on the basis that you would remove the bits that cause psychotic delusions. In the decades that followed, as psychoactive drugs were developed, lobotomy and trepanation rather fell out of fashion. And it wasn't until the mid-60s that the practice was revived, this time as a way of expanding consciousness. And the main person behind that idea was a Dutchman called Bart Hughes. We're going to come back to him a bit later in this story. Now, I'm sure I don't really need to say this, but the Bureau of Lost Culture does not recommend self-trepanation. But now it's time to meet my guest, the man I mentioned at the beginning. Here he is. Joey Mellen. Hello, Joey. Welcome to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Hi, Stephen.
How are you?
Pretty good.
Well, thank you for coming into the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Well, I'm enjoying it.
Very good. Well, listen, I've got this thing here in front of me, and it says, Joey Mellen is an 81-year-old former beatnik.
82.
Oh, right, there we go. So Joey Mellen's an 82-year-old former beatnik who turned on, tuned in, dropped out, and of course used an electric drill to make a hole in his skull. But we're going to come back to that. It's quite interesting, isn't it, to be described as a former beatnik. I mean, what is a beatnik? Or what was a beatnik?
Well, a beatnik, the beatific vision, officially, wasn't it? That was the sort of what it stood for.
Is that right?
Yeah.
The beatific vision of what?
The beatific vision. Well, the beatific vision. They were visionary. I mean, Ginsberg was the sort of prototype, and Kerouac, and those writers' generation, they coined the phrase. So if one sort of dropped out, I mean, which I did, and started smoking dope, that was the sort of big change.
Before you became a former beatnik, you were a beatnik, but before you were a beatnik, you were a kind of pre-beatnik, I guess. But let us just start at the beginning. Give us a kind of whistle-stop tour through the early years of Joe Mellen. You know, where were you born and when were you born?
Well, I was born in Essex, in a little farmhouse. My father was American, and he'd come to Oxford University and married my mother, who was English, and settled down and got a job in the city. He really liked riding his horse and that sort of thing. That was his pleasure. And he used to go off to the city every morning, come back and ride his horse. He made lots of money in the city. You know, you get very well paid in that place. God knows what you do, but you play with money. I mean, I think that's what they do. Their commodity is money. But my father died when I was 14 while I was at Eton, which was very sad because I adored my father.
For anybody who doesn't know, Eton is, or was anyway, the kind of, it was the sort of creme de la creme of sort of English private school education. Well, most famously, recently, a lot of the top brass of the current Conservative Party. And
I think they've always been predominantly conservative and produced a lot of prime ministers and those sort of things.
It's sort of it's kind of synonymous somehow, isn't it, with kind of privilege?
Yes, completely.
And old money, you know, possibly.
Yes, absolutely. And top people, so-called, in brackets, in inverted commas, you know.
So you've been packaged off there as a young man, that your destiny was being kind of written out for you at an early age. Is that right? Why you were sent to Eton, and you know that.
Yes, I think my mother was a sort of typical English upper class girl who sort of knew a lot about gardening and antiques and that sort of thing, and made a good marriage and produced her sons and would send them to the best schools. That was the sort of traditional way for English upper class ladies to behave.
So you came out of Eton, and then were sort of, your father had died, and you were sort of then expected to kind of, like, as it were, take over the family tradition and become a stockbroker. And
yes, exactly. I went to Oxford University, you know, first in 3 years, which was very nice. At Eton, I'd always had a sort of classical education, Latin and Greek, which I am pleased about because it gives you a great understanding of the meaning of words, which I think is the most important thing in life. The language, to me, is the biggest thing in life, really. I think it's the most wonderful thing, our English language. And it's the most amazing invention of the human being, in my opinion.
In a way, Oxford and Cambridge were the kind of creme de la creme of the kind of university system. So that was all part of that path, wasn't it? Kind of upper middle class path.
Yes.
You know, to kind of produce the next generation of people who
sort
are going
of rulers.
Rulers, yeah.
Yes, right. Because I remember that the map of England in my day in school was covered in large pink areas, which was the British Empire. And, you know, India and Australia and South Africa and great blotches of pink everywhere. You sort of thought, well, we just rule the world. And so that one was brought up in that sort of atmosphere.
Yeah, so it was a training system for
exactly, yes,
to be the rulers,
to bring up the next lot of colonial rulers, you know. But that seems so far in the past now. It's extraordinary that, you know, I was at school in the 40s and 50s. That was before the 60s was a sort of enormous watershed, sort of revolution. It was like a sort of underwater volcano. And it changed everything. But before that, the class system and the whole sort of old traditional way of carrying on, ruling the world, was sort of deep-rooted in the upper middle class and the upper class of it. I was a product of that system.
So you went to Oxford, you studied law, you came out of Oxford, and then, you know, embarked upon, you know, what's meant to be the, you know, the rest of your life, basically, which was working in your father's stockbroker firm after he'd gone. And then, well, tell us what.
As a chartered accountant's article clerk was the lowest form of life on earth, I should think. You spend your whole day in some office ticking ledgers, tick that, tick that, tick that, tick that, and it's just so boring you can't believe. I had 6 weeks study leave for the final exams, and I was reading a book called In Search of the Miraculous by Uspensky, who was a pupil of Gurdjieff. I was getting more and more interested in the book, and I kept saying, I'll just wait till tomorrow to do the accountancy exam revision. And then tomorrow, and then finally I said to myself, no, look, come on. I don't want to go into the city. I don't want to qualify as an accountant. I don't want affluence. I want the miraculous. So I better chuck it and just leave. Now, I hadn't got any money, but it didn't matter because I just felt I've got to go and find out what life's all about. It's not as simple as this, you know. You go to Eton, you go to Oxford, you go into the city, plodding up and down every day in the train to your office. It's just too boring for words. So I decided to just drop out. This was 1963, perhaps, or something like that.
You'd read the Ouspensky book, and were you sort of aware then even that there was sort of something going on? You know, that there was this, what we can call it the counterculture or the underground.
I mean, I think I'd read Aldous Huxley, quite a bit of Aldous Huxley, and I think I'd probably read The Doors of Perception. So I was sort of inclined to that, but I hadn't turned on at that time. But I had a girlfriend. This girl had always been trying to turn me on to pot, you know. And I thought, well, hell, why don't I try it? And I tried it, and I was listening to Ray Charles, and I thought, well, what on earth have I been doing all this time? This is crazy.
What, as in, what have I been missing out on?
What have I been missing out on,
right.
You know? And to listen to music while stoned was so revolutionary in a sense, you know. It really, you just hear so much more. And it just opened my eyes and my ears and everything. And I just never looked back, really. That's when I became a beatnik, I suppose you'd say.
Right. So had you been living at home up until then? Yeah, or...
I'd been living I had a friend from Oxford who had a flat in London, had a little house in London, and he let me stay there without paying rent. So I'd go back at home at the weekends to get my clothes washed.
It's traditional yes. Young man fashion.
Exactly. Yeah.
So you decided to drop out. What did your mother think then, and your family actually?
She was shocked.
How did you explain it?
I didn't really. I just went. Because I knew there was no point. They'd say, well, why don't you qualify anyway? You can always... That was the one thing I didn't want to do. I didn't want to qualify because I didn't want to have to fall back on that as a means of making money. It was too boring. I didn't want to.
Right, so you were sort of deliberately, as it were, kind of
cutting off,
yes. cutting the plan B,
yes,
or the way back behind you by doing that, right?
Yeah.
Were you aware, or were you part of, or were you starting to get part of, like, a kind of London scene? I mean, what was going on? What was?
Well, I was part of the sort of typical upper middle class of deb dances and, you know, that sort of life. And then I got into the sort of smoking world, and everything changed, you know. And then I read On the Road, and not long after that, I'd gone to Spain, and I was in Torremolinos, which, believe it or not, in those days was a little fishing village.
Well, the Costa del Sol sort of
well,
package,
exactly. But in those
holidays.
days, just before it really all started, it was a little fishing village. It was extraordinary.
And was that part of the thing that, like, you know, the kind of the people that you were hanging out with in London did? So you'd sort of all head off to Spain in the sun and carry on smoking with them.
A friend who later married someone called Michael Rainey, they were going to Spain, and they said I could go with them. So I said, yes, that sounds a great idea. So I went to Spain. I liked to be in a hot country, because especially if you're poor. I didn't like cold London. I remember once, penniless in London, wondering where I hadn't got anywhere to sleep that night, and I found a taxi with the door open, and I got in the taxi and slept in the back of the taxi.
In a black cab?
In a black cab, yeah.
Wow, I hope the meter wasn't running.
No, it was just parked by the side of the road, and I just tried the door as I was walking past it.
Excellent. Very good. So you went to Spain. Now, is this the trip to Spain where you took acid for the first time, or
well, I didn't take acid then. I took mescaline.
Mm-hmm.
That was incredible, and that was what really opened up the whole sky.
So one of your friends basically introduced you to mescaline.
He was an American. He gave me mescaline. It was a big trip, and it was absolutely amazing. And I thought, well, this is really what I've been looking for, because I was looking for the miraculous, and that what I found it.
And in Huxley's terms, like, that opened the doors of perception?
Yes, it really did. I mean, pot opened it first, so that's like halfway up the mountain. But then mescaline was at the top of the mountain. Could really see the view from there, you know.
And what was that view like?
Milton said in Paradise Lost, there's an angel flying over. He says, to see from thence distinct each thing on earth. And that's what it felt like. One could see the whole creation, and you could sort of understand and identify with it from the smallest to the biggest, and it's a panoramic vision.
So that totally transformed you, did it?
Yes.
It transformed your outlook on life? And
Yes,
what...
it did, really did.
Right.
And I realised that was the sort of key to understanding the whole. And I think I found the answer. And the answer was to expand your consciousness to the limit and reach what Huxley called the antipodes of the mind. I wanted to travel all around this great universe in the head. Because it's extraordinary, isn't it, that one's got this little brain in the little head, and all one's adventures are actually taking place in the head. I mean, even if you're physically doing things, the consciousness is in your head.
What was it like to come back, to come down to the ground, as it were, from the mountain, coming back to London after that experience then?
Pretty dreary. So I wanted to get back as soon as I could. A friend started a bar, and she was looking for someone to sort of run it. But just because I'd had the training of accountancy, I knew how to sort of do the debits and credits, of a cash book, sort of elementary stuff. So I thought I could do that. I could run the money side of the bar.
You thought your Eton education followed by your Oxford education, followed by the time you were working for stockbrokers, kitted you out to run a bar in Spain. Love it, I love it.
And it was brilliant, actually, because very exciting time. So there one was, smoking dope, drinking red wine. I'd heard about LSD. On the grapevine there was talk about it,
What was the talk?
There was this extraordinary drug which no one had actually had. I eventually ended up in Ibiza. I was sort of drifting around, and I'd sort of hitch a lift with anybody who would take me anywhere. Then I met Bart Hughes.
This is a sidebar about Bart Hughes. Bart Hughes was born on 21st of April 1934. In 1958, he took LSD for the first time and remained a regular user over the next 2 or 3 decades. He became a medical student, possibly to learn more about drugs. He developed many ideas whilst under the influence, including the idea that a piece of apple placed in a vagina was a reliable contraceptive. Don't try that one. He developed his theories about trepanation after reading the theory that human beings' brain capacity has diminished since prehistoric times because we've evolved into creatures who walk upright. A combination of gravity and age conspire to rob us grown-ups of the creativity and energy that we possess when children. A baby's skull has the fontanelle, the soft spot, that allows the brain to expand and contract, to pulsate. By adulthood, the fontanelle has hardened. The brain is no longer elastic. Pulsation decreases. Gravity takes more and more blood from the head. And trepanation, according to Bart, would reverse this loss of blood volume and provide a feeling like one might get from standing on one's head for 10 minutes or from sustained aerobic activity. Against the advice of his concerned friends and unable to find a doctor prepared to drill a hole in his skull, on the 6th of January 1965, Bart determined to embark upon an act of self-trepanation. He took LSD acid and put a dentist's drill to his forehead. He managed to drill a small hole, apparently without damaging any brain tissue, and the hole itself healed up in about 3 days. But he claimed that he'd achieved the permanent high that he sought. He even went to a psychiatric institution to share his experiences. But perhaps not surprisingly, rather than being welcomed with scientific curiosity, attempts were made to make him stay there. Hughes became something of a celebrity. He managed to persuade other people of the validity of his theories. Several people became interested in the idea of trepanation, including, according to Paul McCartney, John Lennon, although most of them did not carry out the act upon themselves. Although he didn't finish his medical studies, Bart went on to work at the Royal Institute for Tropics in Amsterdam and published several books, some still promoting trepanation. He died on the 30th of August 2004 at the age of 70.
I was in the old town of Ibiza. I went with a girl, I think, a friend who took me there. There were these two men talking, and one of them was actually called Frederick. It was a group called Nina and Frederick. I think they were Danes or something. They were like sort of Viking, rather good-looking, tall Viking, and his Moll, who was also sort of a tall Viking, and they sang these sort of duets, you know. And Frederick was talking to this guy, and the guy, who was actually Bart, I heard him saying, well, do you see a future in LSD? And my ears pricked up. And I then soon got talking to him, and it turned out that he had actually made LSD with a friend of his in Amsterdam, and he was just going back to Amsterdam to get it. So I knew that I'd finally found the Holy Grail.
So for you guys, like that, you'd heard about acid. It was, I mean, Huxley had taken it famously, hadn't he, on his deathbed, and sort of the rumours were circulating, but nobody had actually taken it. And then,
that's right,
sort of, as it were, by a twist of fate, you overhear somebody talking about it, and you were, I've got to follow this through.
Yes, and he came back a couple of weeks later, and I was waiting at the ferry to meet him, and I spotted him coming in. I said, have you got it? And he said, yes.
You were keen.
Come and take a trip tonight.
Right.
So I did. And I took this trip, found this little flat in the old town of Ibiza. And Bart and his girlfriend were there too. And halfway through the trip, there was a window which you could just step out of the window onto the street. And the window opened halfway through the trip. In stepped Alan Sisko, who was the guy who'd given me the mescaline the year before, you know. That was extraordinary. I said, would you want to take a trip? And he said yes, and so he took a trip. Bart had come with a bag of sugar lumps and a lemon, and he squeezed the lemon into a bowl, and he said, dip the sugar lumps in the lemon and eat that. It'll help you keep grounded.
I wanted to dig into this. I've heard about it before. The acid's on the sugar lump, right? Mm-hmm. You need the sugar.
The brain metabolism is the oxidation of glucose. The only energy source for the brain is glucose. There's 18 billion neurons in your brain. I mean, you can't even really get your head around that. It's so a vast number. When you expand your consciousness, many more are functioning at the conscious level than normal. That means they're consuming huge amounts of glucose. So the sugar level of the blood falls down. And that means that you get various distortions of the functioning of the brain. Visually, you get hallucinations. You can get auditory hallucinations too. But the other significant thing is it becomes harder and harder to sort of concentrate on words. And words are how one is in control of oneself through thinking. And so you can't think properly. Well, I like thinking. And actually I think thinking is the most enjoyable part of life. And even though I enjoy hallucinations, they can be quite fun. Mm. They're boring after a time. Mm. And I much prefer to have that full light beam. It's like upping the wattage in the brain. Have a really bright light to shine on whatever you're thinking about, than a dull.
I've heard this because Michael Hollingshead was a big on leading people through trips, and also his thing was that you need to eat sweets. Because just to take you back for a moment to Bart, so Bart gives you the sugar cube, and then the lemon juice, which is the citric acid. What's that for?
The sugar level is controlled between insulin, if it's too much, and adrenaline, if it's too little. But for the synthesis of adrenaline, you need ascorbic acid, vitamin C. So that's why you need to take vitamin C with an acid trip as a safety measure, just so that you'll always have adrenaline. So your sugar level is not going to fall below the adrenaline level. If you don't take sugar and you let it get down to that level, it can quite often give you horror trip.
Right.
Because you get associations with fight, flight and fright situation.
The appliance of science here, isn't it? I mean,
Bart was a son and grandson of doctors, and he was a medical student, and he was the top medical student of his year, and all the professors had asked him to be their assistant when he qualified and everything. And then, because he met a group of people that he liked, and he noticed that they were all smoking dope, and he looked into it and he saw it's not toxic, and he thought, well, he'd try it, and he really liked it. And so he started telling his professors, because he was a medical student, they should try it, which didn't go down at all well, because in those days drugs were, there was a sort of blanket term for badness.
Still is.
Not quite so much. Psychedelics are getting almost mainstream now for therapy and things like that. But in those days it was completely taboo.
So he was being a bit rash there, advising his professors to try weed.
And then he was busted for having weed. You see, he met a Titi, who was an African drummer, really nice guy, and he used to stand there, and he said, Bart met him at a party, and he was standing on his head for about 20 minutes. Bart was puzzled by this, and when finally Titi got up, he said, why are you standing on your head? And he said, well, because I got no weed. If I haven't got any weed, I stand on my head. And he said, wait a minute, I haven't got weed and you stand on your head. Oh, I see, yes, of course. That was the sort of eureka moment when he realised that's what it was.
Right.
It was putting more blood in the capillaries of the brain.
Which goes on to be his whole theory, which leads to the whole trepanation thing. Sort of scientific medical background, hence is the whole thing about the sugar and the ascorbic acid.
Yes.
So when that first night for you, when, in this flat in Ibiza, I'm imagining he gave you quite a heroic dose, did he, of his homemade acid?
In those days, the standard dose was 250 micrograms. And the reason for that was that when Hoffman synthesized LSD in the first place, by accident, he'd absorbed some through his fingers or something, and he'd got on a trip, and it was in wartime in 1938 or 39 or something, and he'd gone on a bicycle back home, and he'd really got very wobbly, and big things had really started happening. And he thought, wow, what the hell was that? So he decided the next day, or soon afterwards, he would test this substance and see if that could have been what was causing his extraordinary trip. And he took what he thought was the smallest dose he could imagine could possibly have any effect, which was 250 micrograms. Micrograms a millionth of a gram, so it's a very small amount. You can't even see it, it's so small. And he had a massive trip, and he told his colleagues, and they didn't believe him at first, and then they took a sort of third of his trip, and they all got trips too. So. But anyway, the point I'm really making is that 250 micrograms had become the standard trip. Well, actually, 250 micrograms is a very big trip, massive trip. 70 micrograms is enough to give you a good trip. So 250 was big. And that was, in those days, the standard dose, that everybody took. You take 250 micrograms of acid. So everybody was really freaking out.
So what was that like for you then, that first
well, it was great. But you see, if you've got the sugar, you're enlightened to an extraordinary extent, because glucose is synthesized in photosynthesis in plants from the sunlight. So you take it, goes back into your brain, and it becomes light again. It's sunlight in the brain. And as the sugar level falls, you begin to get distortions. And you get all kinds of weird things happening, which is fine if you're in a nice place and you like it, and you get it can be very nice.
Well, it sounds like you were in safe hands with Bart. He knew what he was doing. He knew what he was doing in terms of dosing and what you took with it and stuff.
Yes.
So, and how did that compare with your mescaline experience then? It
was the same level. Mescaline it's a starry night in the desert, because it's from a cactus and you get beautiful colours, and whereas, for example, psilocybin is a sort of mauvey, mushroomy, swampy sort of, but they're both high, but they have their particular sort of characteristics. Acid has really no characteristics. Like mescaline's got this starry night thing, and mushroom's got the swampy purple thing. Acid is just you times 10.
Times 250 in this case.
Well,
So and how was it?
it was brilliant.
And so you'd already kind of dropped out, but I suppose these experiences, you know, the dope, then the mescaline, then the acid, is just going to deepen your sense of actually dropping out, isn't it? So you had actually now tuned in, hadn't you? You tuned in, you turned on.
Yeah, turned on, tuned in. Well, I dropped out, turned on, and then tuned in.
When you came back to London after this, you then became a sort of acid evangelist for a while. Did you bring acid with from Bart?
I did, yes. I brought some of Bart's acid, and I then found, I met Mike Hollingshead. Well, I told you he met me, and he had a supply, unlimited supply of acid, which was very useful.
We've done a couple of programmes about Hollingshead. So he'd come back from the States where he turned Leary on, and then he opened this World Psychedelic Centre. And I think Andy Roberts told me that it was all very serious. It was all like guided trips using the Tibetan Book of the Dead and all that stuff.
Yes, that's right, exactly.
So you had a very different approach to it, didn't you? So tell us about that.
As I say, he used to take sort of low light room with slides of mandalas and, sort of banging on about the Tibetan Book of the Dead. So boring. I was just saying, here you are, take acid, but remember, take some sugar and take some vitamin C. And so people were just having a really nice time. And he saw that, and he was impressed. And I said, you're missing the point. I mean, you don't have to do this whole thing with mandalas. It can be very nice if you like it, but I just prefer to have a good time. And all you need is sugar and vitamin C. And so that's when he started having sugar and sweets and things and advising people to take vitamin C.
He was quite a mixed character, wasn't he?
He was. And the trouble was, he used to take smack as well, He was a funny fellow. He got busted and went to jail for quite a long time. I went and visited him in jail. He was very clever, highly intelligent, basically sex hungry, and he was always trying to take advantage of girls by giving them, which I don't like that.
Andy Roberts describes him as a psychopath, actually.
Yes, I think he was.
So you'd become a bit of an evangelist because you'd had this very positive experience. So you were actually turning people on and introducing them to acid. And I guess at the time as well, it was becoming much more part of the culture around you. So what was going on, in London? Did you feel then you were part of this thing that was starting to happen?
Yes, there was a tremendous thing. And the music scene was marvellous. The Beatles and the Stones and all those groups. The 60s was incredible. I mean, one really felt that we were changing the world if you were inside that bubble, You
felt like you were on the edge of something?
Yes.
These changes were going to happen and were going to transform everything?
It was like a revolution, but a revelation. I mean, it certainly was nothing armed about it. But it was a revolution in culture. It was a revolution in the sort of class system. It broke down, Before that, it had been very rigid. And people sort of knew their place and stayed in there. And, it's really hard to imagine now when I look back.
You were from the upper middle class background. But, you're all mixing up together, right, as well? The Beatles were working class, right?
Yes, exactly. And I think the thing was that teenagers had a bit of money in their pockets. So they could buy records and tune in and get into the swing of this new, exciting, revolutionary situation, evolutionary, really. But termed it the evolutionary religion.
Before we come back to Bart, where were you living? How were you surviving? What were you doing for money?
It was always a difficulty. One muddled through, one way or another. I got a marvellous job in Ibiza. Some Belgian millionaire or something who'd owned property in the Belgian Congo, and he needed someone to do the accounts for him. And I had a girlfriend who said, who knew him and worked he had a club, said, would you like to do this? And I said, sure. So I came and did all these schedules for him. I got 11,000 pesetas, which was £66, but that was enough for a summer.
Right.
It was
survive for summer. Yeah. So you live in hand to mouth, basically, and just on goodwill and good vibes.
Yes.
So you'd stayed in contact with Bart, and that's quite important in terms of what happens next, because you mentioned that, you know, he'd been making acid, but also he'd had this insight with the guy who stood on his head.
Yes.
That the whole thing about consciousness expansion and the biochemistry of the brain,
Yes.
right? And then he develops this theory about trepanation, about, you know, putting a hole in your head, positive consequences that he believed that would have, right?
Yes.
So he sort of developed this theory, and then as a consequence he had put a hole in his own head in a quite scientific way. But this had got an ancient tradition, hadn't it? Right the way back.
It's the oldest operation in the world. I mean, nobody knows, obviously, but I suspect that it was originally done for axe wounds or something, you know, where there's a bit of bone depressed or something, and they've just taken it out, and they found that people who had the holes in the head seemed to have got some advantage. I mean, it's still done in primitive places. The Kisi tribe in Kenya still does it today. Well, I don't know if they do, but they did. In my lifetime, I've seen film of it.
He rediscovered or come up with the idea that this could make a difference. Then he actually did it himself, to himself. And he started to tell other people about it, and of course, because you knew him through your acid experiences, is that you became interested in doing that yourself, right? Didn't you?
I decided that the most important thing in life for me was to expand my consciousness as far as possible, because that's everything. What is life without consciousness? I mean,
did you feel that there was a limit to the way you could do that through the use of mescaline and LSD? Did you feel that was not sufficient, that in a way there needed to be something else beyond that?
I think the advantage of trepanation, it's not a huge high, nothing like hash or acid. If you had a scale of, say, 0 to 100, then 0 would be the normal adult state of consciousness. So maybe 50 would be a good smoke, and 100 would be an acid trip. Then trepanation would be sort of 30. But the thing with trip was there's a sort of parabola. You go up, and then you go along the top, and then you gradually come down. And the worst bit is always the very last bit, when you're coming down to the sort of aches and pains of adult life.
Mundane life.
Yes, mundane life, exactly. And the advantage with trepanation is that you don't have that last bad come down bit. You stay just above that.
Now is the time to mention your book, because you wrote Borehole, you know, in 1970, and it's been republished obviously since in an expanded form. But you know, the byline is, this is the story of how I came to drill a hole in my head to get permanently high. And it's quite a story, Joey, because you had decided to do this thing, and actually it took you 3, almost 4 attempts, didn't it, really?
Yes, it did, yes.
And I wanted to just read from the book, I think one of your first attempts. I was living back in London, and it was 1967. At that time I was broke, and I certainly couldn't afford an electric drill, so I bought a hand trepan from a surgical instrument shop. It's a bit like a corkscrew, really, but with a ring of teeth at the bottom. It has a point in the middle which makes an impression on the skull, and then you turn it until the teeth cut into the skull. It's slightly narrower at the bottom than it is at the top, so it pulls a circular piece of skull out once you're through with it. When you pull it out, it was difficult. It was like trying to uncork a bottle of wine from the inside. That's a very interesting sort of metaphor, isn't it? Or simile, actually. It was like trying to uncork a bottle of wine from the inside.
Yes.
The trepan was blunt, and I couldn't get any purchase on my own skull. I was tripping on acid. I thought that it was the only way I could get through doing it, but it didn't work. So not only did you decided to do it, but you also decided to do it on acid. That was for courage, Dutch courage. Dutch courage, right?
Yes.
Okay. I mean, because in a way, from the outside, just from my perspective, as a sort of super anxious type, it sounds a terrifying idea. I mean,
well, I was very familiar with acid, and I knew on acid I was completely in control of myself, and I knew how to do that, and I knew that I didn't have the fear.
Right. Okay.
Lower down, I had the fear, you know.
Right. So you'd recognise that you're frightened, and so for you, taking the acid was a way to sort of get through that. Right?
Yes.
Yeah. It didn't work out. Right. That first time. And then we should mention now Amanda Fielding, who was your friend and then partner for many, many years, and mother of your kids. And so she had been Bart's girlfriend, right?
Yes. I'd brought Bart to England from Ibiza, started a campaign of trying to get recognition for his discovery. And he'd met Amanda, and who was a friend of mine, and they'd fallen in love, and then he'd been banned from the country
Yeah, it was an undesirable for his
as an
theories.
undesirable character.
I wonder why.
It's very odd, I mean, but it has changed. I mean, nowadays people are taking psychedelics seriously, but in those days they were just scared stiff
It
of
was
it.
terrifying for lots of reasons, wasn't it, to society? Because it was having effects on people where they were dropping out. So,
Yes.
kids like you, who come
Yes.
from this establishment background as well as,
Yes.
working class kids,
Yes.
were suddenly like, well, fuck that.
Fuck
I'm not going
that.
to do that.
Exactly.
So that was obviously very frightening to the establishment, wasn't it?
Yes,
so,
it was.
So Bart had been sort of, been banned from these shores for spreading
Yes.
these revolutionary ideas.
Yes.
And Amanda went back with him, did she?
She went for a short time and then came back.
So when she came back, then you enlisted her to help you with these.
She gave me a room in her flat, which is very kind of her. We were great friends, and later on became lovers. And she helped me trepan myself.
So there was a second attempt where you fainted and had to go to hospital,
Yes.
right? And then you got busted for weed, right, in the intervening times.
Yeah, that's right, yes.
But there was no stopping you, was there? I mean, it was
No,
like you were
I was determined.
determined to do it, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So three failed attempts and a spilt
In jail.
in Chokey. That wasn't going to stop young Joey Mellen from drilling a hole in his
No
head.
way, nothing was. And I said to them in the hospital, "Why don't you just finish it for me, please?" They said, "Well, you must not do that." I knew perfectly well that it was quite safe, as long as you knew how to do it. You had to sterilise everything very carefully. Very careful, obviously.
Yeah, you had to know what you were doing. Right?
You
Yeah,
had to know what you're doing.
You did the third or fourth, whatever it was, attempt, and this time you
With
used
an electric
drill,
Yeah.
right? And even though there was a sort of slightly comic moment partway through where the the plug came out and you had to go down and ask your neighbour downstairs
Yes.
whilst you sort of were spouting blood from your head.
Well, no, I'd put a bandage
You put a
around
bandage around it, but it must have been a bit of shock for him when you knocked on the door. But
He was a
seems
very nice man. And
yeah, but he seems to have taken it in his stride because
Yes.
he came and fixed your drill for
he
you.
fixed the drill. Yes. Yes,
So
that
you
was
carried
very
on.
nice.
You did it on your own.
And this time I wasn't on acid, and it was
Right.
just so I actually really could notice that.
Was it a painful thing? Was it a messy
No,
thing?
not at all, because obviously, I mean, there's no sensation in the bone, but outside the bone, there's skin, muscle, and membrane. There's a membrane outside the skull, and then there's muscle, and there's the skin. So you had to cut through the skin, the muscle, and the membrane, and inject local anaesthetic, which I'd got from a doctor friend, in 3 layers to the skin, the muscle, and the membrane. So, and once that was done, there was absolutely no sensation at all. And then to drill through the skull with the electric drill took no more than about a few minutes.
So you needed a mirror and a sort of steady
Yes.
hand, right?
Yes.
And you knew where to do it. I mean,
Yes.
but Bart had worked all this out, where to do it.
Yes, I mean, you could do it anywhere along the median line
Mm.
is the best thing, because that's where the blood vessels are the thinnest.
And how do you know how deep to go or not to go?
Well, once you're through the skull,
Mm-hmm.
it's very obvious, because boom, the drill goes right through,
Right.
boom. And, I mean, I knew with the electric drill, I could hold it on my hand, like this, 2,000 reps per minute, for a minute, and it didn't even make a mark, because it was so fine, the teeth. It was like almost like sawdust, like sandpaper.
So we're talking about a very small hole here. I mean, a very small.
Yes, it
diameter
was
hole,
about a fingernail, a small
Mm.
fingernail size, something like that.
So you'd succeeded. I'm imagining that there was a sense of relief and achievement in the fact that you'd actually been able to do it.
Yes.
Right. But then also, well, how was it?
You had to clean up all the sort of mess and everything. And I just waited to see what was happening, and gradually I began to feel a certain lightness, and this sort of slightly increased. And after about 3 or 4 hours, I was feeling really, phew, this is really good. I wonder whether it will last the night, I woke up in the morning and I realized, yes, this has really done it. I feel lighter. And I use light in the double sense of the word. Light, like electric light, the sunlight, but also the lightness of the lifting of the weight of gravity, which I think that's what it is. Because Bart always said gravity is the bring down. There's only one thing to be afraid of, that's gravity. It brings you down.
Did you feel different, and did it maintain? And was there a sense
Yes,
was there a sense that life was now going to be different?
I mean, yes, but not sort of spectacularly different. Just I was just very, very pleased to finally have had this lift. That's what it is a lift and a slight increase of energy.
And then Amanda, she wanted you to do it.
She then wanted to do it, and she decided to film it. Well, I mean, I took the filming, but she made a film of herself doing it, it was called Heartbeat in the Brain. It's only a little 15-minute film, which I did rather a good soundtrack to. With Sonny Rollins fusion during the drilling, and a bit of Mozart and a bit of Fats Waller. She, by the way, had been in America while I was doing it, and when she came back, she saw the difference in me, and that's what really made her decide she must do it.
She did it and decided to film it. I mean, what was behind that decision? Not only to actually do it,
I think we wanted to
film
publicise it, to get publicity for it. And she thought a film would be the best thing, which I think it probably was. And I mean, anyone who's seen it was you can't avoid being impressed by it. And
well, she set it up very carefully, didn't she? She looks great. It's all very carefully done, and with the bandages. And when she was done, how do you think it changed her, or how did it affect her?
I mean, you'd really have to ask her that. But I think, I mean, the thing is, she loved taking acid like I did, so we were always getting high. But I think she saw the same thing as me. She felt the difference that it made, and she was very happy to have done it.
Well, so happy, in fact, that she then ran for Parliament.
Yes.
To try and become an MP, based on...
I don't think she was fully expecting to get elected.
But she did have a campaign poster, which I've seen, which is, trepanation on the NHS.
Yes.
Some idea. And got some votes, actually. I think she
trepanation for the national health.
For the national health,
yes.
Right. I love it, right. So she got more votes than I think Enoch Powell did in Notting Hill.
47, I think it was the first time, and I think the second time was 131. So if we sort of extrapolated from that one, after 50 years.
You did, both of you and other people, you took it very seriously. I mean, it was you meant it, didn't you? It was something that you'd done, and you saw it genuinely as a thing that could transform society, be part of this change.
Yes, a very important part of that is the second part of Bart's discoveries, which is the ego mechanism. When the skull seals and the blood is lost to the brain, the parts that would suffer most would be those furthest away from the heart, which is including the speech system. But because we are a thinking animal, and thinking is essential for our survival, we need to keep the speech system centres functioning all the time in our waking life. So this mechanism has evolved. The way it works is that you talk a word, the listening centre recognises the word, the meaning of the word, and the recognition of the meaning of the word is a trigger for the reflex action of more blood to go to the talking centre. And that's what Bart discovered, that's how it worked.
So he linked thinking and the blood supply, basically.
Yes. What Bart called this mechanism was the ego. So for your identity, you need to be thinking. And people build up a sense of identity, which includes their beliefs and systems, and they're Christian or a Muslim or a
beatnik.
Beatnik, yes, exactly. Any sort of isms there are that people adhere to become extremely important, and indeed so important that almost all the wars and persecutions and so on in the past have been people defending their egos against other people's different meanings they've given them, and so there's this sort of madness going on all the time. It's completely unnecessary. I mean, it's all the ego.
So for you guys, this was a liberation from ego.
Yes,
right.
exactly.
So it had that effect on you as well as this sense of lightness. And then you wanted to pass that on to other people, so hence
Yes.
Amanda running for Parliament. And then you basically, you guys, you became, you were partners, you were living together, you had a gallery, you were living the kind of countercultural life.
Yes.
Weren't you? What did your family make of this? Because you became known, even then, around London as the guy who trepanned himself.
I mean, my mother was completely she just couldn't take it at all. I said, why don't you take a trip and you'll see?
She didn't get that?
No, she didn't go there. She disinherited me, and that was her problem. It wasn't.
What happened to Bart?
Well, he went back to Holland and he got a job in the Tropical Museum where he could study. He studied the tar, and he lived in a very poor part of town. He had a wife and 2 children, and the wife split from him, and Bart decided that people had to study his work, and if they didn't, he wouldn't meet them. And this was idiotic, actually, because he was a very charismatic person, and if he hadn't had that policy, because he'd said to me, I remember earlier, he said, nobody can see me unless they study my work and do their homework, which is to copy out all my things for 10 times. I mean, it's completely mad.
Bit demanding. So what happened to him?
He drank himself to death.
Right.
He knew how to do it. I mean, he was a complete master of the science of medicine and biology. He was amazing. He was a genius.
It's quite tragic, isn't it? Because it's not
but
alone.
It's tragic. Well, he had an absolute love and affinity with animals of all kinds. Bit like Francis of Assisi or something. I mean, he collected lizards, and he used to go in his holidays hitchhiking all around Europe, catching snakes and lizards. He had an enormous room full of something like 200 of different types of reptiles, and including a crocodile.
Okay, that's not the sort of place I would want to go over to take an acid. There's no way I'm going into a room with a crocodile in it.
The neighbours got really... because he put a sort of branch of a tree out of his window, and the crocodile used to go and sun itself. The neighbours complained he had to give it to the zoo.
You and Amanda were, together for a long time. You had kids together, and then you parted, and then your wife now, I mean, who you met, and she wanted you to trepan her. And
well, a friend of hers did it. I told him. I said I wouldn't do it. I said it wasn't my job to trepan people. It was just to inform them, because I didn't want to get labelled as the trepanner.
No, of course. Yeah,
and it would be dangerous, and I don't like danger. Well, I mean,
No, I mean, you don't want to take... I know you've been very clear about you do not recommend people to be trepanned, and you're not suggesting that they should.
I'm not. I'm suggesting this should be done in the National Health. And what's ridiculous is that when you think of it, this, what do they call it, cosmetic surgery, they do.
So what was it like for your wife when she had it done afterwards? Did she have a similar experience to you, this lightening?
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
I mean, she was obviously impressed by your energy and your sort of your being enough to want to do it for herself, and so did that bring you closer together? Then she did it as well.
Well, I mean, I was in love with her, and yes, I mean, it did. We are very close. We have been very close always.
Joey, we are at the end. I've just got a couple of more questions for you. It was a long time ago that you did it. 50 years, isn't it? Over 50 years. I don't know whether the hole is sealed up again.
No, it doesn't.
It doesn't seal up.
That's
right?
the beauty of holes in the skull.
Right.
Anywhere else they seal, but not in the skull.
Right. So it's still there, and do you feel that it's still having an effect? Or
yes.
Yeah, you do. You can still feel it. Do you still take acid?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you microdose, or do you take sort of heroic doses, or?
I do a bit of both.
Mm-hmm. You started off, you said this is the story of how I came to drill a hole in my head to get permanently high.
Yes.
Did it happen?
Yes.
Joey, thanks very much for coming to the Bureau of Lost Culture.
Thank you, I enjoyed it.
The delightful Joey Mellen. As Joey said, don't do this at home. I'm not sure Joey's hope that it will be available on the NHS will come to pass in the near future. But it is true that there is a great interest, thankfully, and a great likelihood that some psychedelic drugs will be legalised in the near future. I at least am very strongly in favour of that. I should just say that I could see a mark, if not a hole, on Joey's head, but apparently that was from one of the botched attempts, not the successful one. You can read more about Joey's exploits in his wonderful book, Borehole, available from Strange Attractor Press. Come and join us at the Bureau of Lost Culture. If you go to bureauoflostculture.com, as well as being able to enjoy all our previous episodes, you can sign up for our mailing list to get very special Bureau of Culture treats, and if you like, you can help support us in our wild endeavours. Thanks for listening. We'll be back next time with more tales from the other side. This episode of the Bureau of Lost Culture was sponsored by the artist known as the Real Tuesday Weld. www.tuesdayweld.com. Here they are with the track Miles from the album Tape Dust Memories.